So in this meditation, again continuing the thread of the thinking on the awakened heart by Gerald May, in this chapter he addresses, and we want to think and pray about, the whole concept of freedom and intention. And in fact I would add also prayer, because as you'll see, he actually spends quite a bit of time gradually leading us through this whole desire for love, that it's actually there within us, that love promises freedom, but that it's always flawed with that Achilles heel of the addictions, that we get stuck in things, and we have to safeguard against that. So in this section then on freedom and intention, he starts off by saying, let me say it again, from love's perspective, everything is a matter of choice. So it goes without saying that we cannot love unless at some stage we also choose to love. It's one thing to have this innate capacity for love that God has made us. It's part of our DNA, you might say. But unless we choose freely, we deliberately choose to go along with it, then it will just remain choked and nothing will happen. So he goes on to say that because of the sheer number of loves that we do have, we actually must make most of our choices unconsciously and automatically. And you might think, hang on a minute, how can I choose unconsciously? Well, I can, because I've trained myself to do that. You think, for instance, just for a few moments, behaviors that you have now, or reactions that you have to various things that you actually have been doing since you were little children. And somewhere along the line you learn to respond in this or that way, and you still see the traces of it, even if you don't necessarily respond in exactly the same way. I remember for a long time just not knowing how to handle a compliment. If somebody praised me, because in the Maltese culture at the time, well, you don't praise little children. So, of course, as a child, everybody loves to be praised and to be told that you're doing the right thing and so forth. But to actually be told that, well, okay, you don't want to do it too much, just in case you might spoil the child. So, I had to learn that it's okay to feel and to receive a compliment, that you don't have to think it's strange or deny it or pretend it's not true. And there's a whole lot of other things, whether it's the practice of eating or certain manners, or what we thought were manners we picked up, and we learn to do them automatically. But there are other things even deeper itself, things about love, things about receiving affection, things about how we think regarding ourselves, how we value ourselves, that also we've trained ourselves automatically to do them. This is what he's getting at. So we've made certain choices, and they happen again and again, unconsciously and automatically. So we rely on our conditioned habits to do this. Some habits are absolutely practical. We don't touch, for instance, hot stoves. Somewhere along the line we learned not to do that, We may have learned the hard way, being burnt, and we don't even remember being burnt, but we've learned not to touch a hot stove. We look both ways before we cross a street. How many times have our mothers or fathers or older brothers or sisters told us, look the other way, don't just run, whatever. And, I don't remember, but I hear a story in my family when my older brother was, I think, not even 2 years old, or maybe just around the 2-year-old mark, and just started walking across the road, and a car was coming, and he just bumped into the truck, and the truck bounced him back the other way, thank God, and he's still alive now. But it could have been so easy the other way round, and I'm not sure whether he'd remember that at all. It was my father who told me the story, but somewhere along the line I'm sure he got a bit of a stern looking, and my mother, after he was shaken up, I would have told him, we don't do that, we don't do that. But those things certainly are impacting. So we are conditioned and to do certain things, and we've chosen to actually act in particular ways. But he goes on then to say that conditioning can be efficient or inefficient. And we call efficient conditioning a talent, a gift, or a good personality trait. And then conditioning can function poorly. When it functions poorly, we call it a bad habit. And he says, I have a bad habit of cracking jokes when I am angry. It is an ingrained way of unconsciously choosing to express hostility. Some will do it by having some kind of a nervous laughter when they don't know how to act or handle a situation that's uncomfortable or unpleasant. They'll start laughing or giggling. I remember one time I was at a wedding rehearsal, and it was an older couple, true story this, older couple, and we're just going through the vows. So I'm starting to get to the bridegroom, and he was in his 60s and she was pretty close, the same age too. And as I said, I so-and-so take you to be my wife. He started and I thought, okay, he'll stop, And this went on, honestly, for 30 seconds to a minute. And I thought, how at that time a minute seems like an hour or something. And then I looked to the best man, who was his grown son. I said, and he looks to me, he says, I don't know, he's never done it before, But that was, anyway, thank God he snapped out of it, and I thought, oh, what's going to happen the next day, Thankfully it all went off without a hitch, But I heard another story about that sort of thing from a priest who's retired now, and the bride just laughing uncontrollably, and this is on the wedding day, and the priest or the bridegroom is looking at the priest, and the priest is looking at him. He says, what do you do? And the bridegroom said to the priest, I don't know, just slap her, So the priest gave her a slap on the cheek, and she snapped out of it and was able to do it, Now I suppose if a priest did that now, he'd be in trouble. But anyway, so they're those sorts of habits that somehow we learn along the way, and we don't ever question them until something happens to make us question them. To say the least, then, in choosing amongst the loves that we have, actually making a conscious choice, the balance between habit and freedom is always a delicate one, because we do need habits. We need good habits, and we'll call them virtues, and that makes it easier for us then to make them always in the future. But the moment they become unconscious to us, we really lose a certain control over them. And in terms of what's coming later on, having an awakened heart, it does actually restrict the kind of awareness that we have, and then with which we're able to love. So that's why he says the habit and the freedom, the balance is delicate, because on the one hand we want to be aware of as much as possible, so that we can have real full freedom, but we also know that we, by nature, to survive, must make a lot of choices unconsciously by having learnt them over the years. So then he proposes a path, really, that the aim, what we should choose, is to choose love itself, to always, rather than having all the many different loves, and some of them will compete with one another, not some, many of them, to choose always love itself. And he goes on and says, when we are really given to the why of life, the hows begin to flow. The why of life is the reason for living, which is about loving. But remember, at the very beginning we said that we often have this thing about efficiency, loving or efficiency. And so much of our worth and our value is measured by how efficient we are, and that this is ultimately a killer when it comes to our ability to love. He says they come less from conditioning and more from our larger, deeper desire. This is no panacea, so an overall solution. It does not remove us from pain and struggle. On the contrary, choosing love itself, it invites us into exquisite vulnerability. But the freedom and the meaning are immense. When we always make a choice for love, to choose love, again, it might sound corny sometimes, depending on which circles we're mixing in, but it's actually the profoundest thing that we could do, to be open to love, and to choose it. To choose it very willingly is the necessary engagement of our will that then allows grace to transform us. No matter how we may squirm to find a way out, we cannot escape being part of creation. Even suicide cannot remove our impact upon the universe. It only darkens it. Moreover, we cannot avoid being essential to it. We may lack political power and religious sophistication. We may be largely ignorant of the workings of our own minds. We may be beaten down by the circumstances of our lives and by the choiceless choices our addictions impose upon us. We even may be rejected by our friends and scorned by our colleagues. But creation would miss us if we were not here. We are significant, precious, and needed, not just for the choices we make and the actions we take, but for our very presence. How often do we realize or stop to think that the world would be a poorer place without me, without you? That's not a selfish statement of self-aggrandizement. You know, sometimes I've said that to people. I mean, I remember hearing the story of a guy who, his mother actually tried to abort him, and the abortion failed, and now he's very active in the church in Australia, and a beautiful story. And I just wrote back to him and I said, the world is a better place because you're in it. I mean, he hadn't done anything wrong, but the fact is, he's making a contribution. And the loving that each of us does in the world, does change the world and make it better. God has put us in the world for a particular purpose, and in discovering that, it's ultimately about making an impact on the world, a positive impact, through our willingness to love, and choosing that every day, every day. We seldom realize our preciousness. We are so busy, so occupied with many little things, that we are blind to the one great thing. Only in the pauses between things, in the brief contemplative spaces of just being, can we catch a glimpse of love itself. So here we're saying there are so many different competing elements of love. Great. Love in general promises freedom. But with all the busyness, and this is why it's so important for us to actually learn how to step back and to recognize, even in our busyness, those pockets where love is making itself present. Remember the first talk we had on this was bearing the beams of love. Those beams, those rays come to us when we least expect it. It is a gift. But as we learn to see them, that's where those spaces begin to fill up, or open up rather, in our day-to-day living. And that will lead us to the awakening that we're going to talk about in just a few moments. In the momentary emptiness, only in the pauses between things, in the beginning, in the brief contemplative spaces of just being, can we catch a glimpse of love itself. Even then, we often feel so unfree that we think we are unworthy of love. But the glimpses keep coming. In the momentary emptiness, when an addictive need is not yet satisfied, in encountering a situation which we do not know what to do, in finding ourselves giving or receiving a touch of tenderness for no reason at all, in the spontaneous eruption of laughter, another small space opens. The invitation is given again. When he talks, about that emptiness of an addictive need, so often when we are striving for love, and remember the addictive need that he's talking about is not some substance abuse, but rather those misfirings, you might say, where the love is tempted to become disordered for one thing or another. It might be as simple as, eating a piece of chocolate. Am I eating a piece of chocolate because I need something sweet or maybe a bit of nourishment? I'm sure chocolate has some nourishment in it. Or is it because I've got to fill in the emptiness that I'm feeling at the moment? Sometimes food is abused like this, whatever it might be. But that's what he's talking about. I'm sensing there's an addictive impulse coming within me. And at that moment, as I become aware of it, I have a choice to make. It's at that moment that I also feel powerless and helpless. Remember, the adventure of being involved in love is ultimately an adventure where we are not in control. And it's at that moment, and he argues about this in his earlier book, Addiction and Grace, that we need the grace of God to lift us up. But the way the grace of God so often comes to our rescue is not by taking away that feeling of emptiness, that feeling of the addiction is drawing me to that bad behavior, but rather to live with the tension, to live in that place of yuckiness, that place of unpleasantness, awkwardness, whatever word you want to put in there, but keeping on praying at that moment, because that's when the grace will eventually, the moment will pass, and I will remain faithful to the right direction of loving. These are the spaces that he is trying to get us to pay attention to. So it keeps coming back then to the fact that we have to keep saying yes and exercise our will to do and choose the right thing constantly. Saying yes to love works, but not in the way we might expect. How then? It is the working of love, not of efficiency. The tendency constantly to want to turn love into, I want to be good at loving, just like I want to be good at anything else I do in life. The moment I start thinking like that, Gerald May would say, I've tried to turn love into just another efficiency thing in life. The way we may measure a business or the effectiveness of a student or something like that. We cannot control the love in the same way as we control other things. We must be part of it. It involves intention, but not success or failure. It invites dedicated practice, but not achievement or competence. It is a conscious choice toward openness instead of control. Saying yes to love is not a method for breaking the chains of addiction or solving our problems, but a response to the essential goodness of love itself. It comes not from our desire to get away from something bad, but from our desire to welcome something wonderful. It is opening our hearts to give to a gift already given. To use Ibn al-Arabi's terms, it is the heart embracing the reality that embraces and fills the heart. So what are these then, the best of intentions, to give our will, to exercise it in the proper way that's really going to lead us to freedom, or at least most of the time, if not all the time, because we cannot always succeed. Desire is wanting something, longing for some satisfaction. Intention is claiming the wanting, consciously owning it, choosing to seek satisfaction. And then control is what we are able to do to make the satisfaction happen. We desire much and can intend anything we choose, but our control is limited. So there's the desire in all of us to love. But we can choose to love or choose to not love. And then the control, well, we only have a limited control. And that's a mistake that often I think we can make, to think that we can control certain things that are in fact beyond our control. A child wants to fly like a bird, that is desire. She decides to try, that is intent. She tries and fails, that is control, or rather the absence of it. We usually do not know what are the best, most loving of our many desires, because they're just there. But intention allows us to do our best, to choose the best. Having chosen, we often fail, or later learn that our choice was mistaken. Still, we can know we have done our best in the choosing and in the doing, and that is our only authenticity. Even a conscious, freely chosen no to love is more true and more human than 1,000 reflexive, conditioned, addicted yeses. So, when we are actively and very willingly and deliberately choosing love, this is not something about willfulness here, but rather a conscious, deliberate choosing. Then what starts to happen gradually, Gerald May would say, is that there's an awakening that starts to happen, because we're always on the watch for the next opportunity for genuine, deep love that is often beneath all the different loves that we have, from the more superficial to the more profound, and the different daily experiences of that. Intention, then, he says, needs space within which to express itself. It also requires two other things: human awakening and divine grace. Our heart's desire goes on no matter what. It is awake even when we sleep. But when we accept the invitation of love, our minds must awaken to our hearts. We must sense our desire and know our intent. We may not know exactly how or why we are choosing, and we most certainly do not know what we are letting ourselves in for, because love is an adventure that we cannot fully understand and yet will satisfy us. But we need to realize our act of opening. The yes to love, chosen with immediate awareness and full responsibility, is the absence of certain knowledge. In the absence of certain knowledge, is the most free and authentic thing a human being can do. It is what the human will was created for. So, what's this awakening then mean? What does it mean to have a realization? Something is going from sleep, a sense of sleep, to an alertness, an awakening. Some awakenings come in flashes, but more often we awaken in stages, as if emerging from a dream. It's like when we are pondering over a problem. Initially, we can't solve it, but then we realize, okay, I can't stay at the books anymore, so I go for a walk. Do the walk, come back, get changed, shower, whatever. And then I sit down and have a cup of tea And as I'm just having a cup of tea, unwinding, something breaks through, and I just have a little insight. Doesn't mean I have a solution to the entire problem, but I've moved a step. Why? Somewhere where I was before, there was a blockage there. There wasn't the awakenedness to actually recognize how to go the next step. And so I had to leave that and then move back to do something else, to the exercise or whatever, and then to be able to come back to the problem and realize now I'm in a position to go the next step. I remember a philosopher in the seminary who said to us at one point, he says, I reach a point sometimes when I can no longer philosophize. I can't read it, I can't really teach it. And I find that the only solution for me is I've got to go mountain climbing. And when I climb a mountain or two, I can come back and do philosophizing. And I don't know what it was about him, but as I've seen different obstacles in my own life, I realize, I like mountain climbing too. There's a sense of achievement, a sense of doing something different. It's very physical, strenuous. You come back and it clears the mind. It really does. So the awakenings come in flashes. It's a gradual awakening that happens. But once it happens, you can't go back to sleep again. Once this awakening happens, it's like the genie has come out of the bottle. You can't put it back in there. So it's a deep spiritual alertness that he's talking about. Contemplatives throughout history have understood much of this arrangement without knowing, so it says the neurology, how the brain works. Again and again, they have described how their spirits were awakened and stirred to life by their desire for love. I remember when I first discovered my priestly vocation, I wanted to be a priest when I was a child, but it wasn't until something happened when I was 17 years of age. And I was at Mass, and just this realization over weeks or months, I don't remember now, of what was going on at Mass. The power of the consecration. There's no external noise, but the realization that God has just come down on the altar. And I remember thinking to myself, why is it all these people kneeling down? They're acting as if nothing has changed after the consecration from before. But that was the awakening that hit me, which eventually then led to an awareness that God was calling me to the priesthood. But so he's talking about these sorts of awakenings, that they're deeper realities. They're not an awakening that is happening every day. They're deeper moments in our lives. For a long time, it seems the sole purpose of awakening is to gratify specific desires. At the outset, we may be awakened by something as mundane as desire for food, or a dry diaper, a nappy, or a warm cup of cocoa. But after its initial awakening by desire, consciousness grows. So that's what he's getting at here. That's the kind of awakening, that there's a real deeper consciousness there. Just as we have many loves, we have many kinds of awakenings. And that's we need to keep that very much in mind. The contemplatives say there is a level at which all our hearts are always saying yes to love, regardless of how dulled or preoccupied our conscious minds are, and regardless of how unloving our actions may be. Because we keep ourselves so dull, so often, and occupied most of the time, he says, I am certain that these awakenings come from the power of love's grace, weaving itself through our moments and circumstances, calling us to notice the wonder of our being and empowering us, if we so choose, to intend ourselves toward our deepest desire. Grace comes as a gift. We can neither earn it nor make it happen, but grace invites us to participate. It needs our involvement. And I think that's, for a Christian, that is, he's obviously writing not just for Christians, but for a wider audience. For a Christian, we take that for granted. Any real awakening, any breakthrough, that's another word that would match what he's talking about with the awakening. Any breakthrough always comes as a result of an impulse of grace. It's just, we cannot earn that, we cannot decide that or force it. God knows the right moment, and he gives it to us. I remember one of the hardest thing I ever had to do was to, as a priest, was to tell a couple that they should separate, because the relationship had become so toxic and so destructive, and the woman was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, a mental breakdown, already on antidepressants and so forth. But it wasn't always like that. As I spent a lot of time with them, I realized something happened 2 years earlier, and she'd had an awakening, an emotional awakening, a mental awakening, a spiritual awakening, that she was in a very destructive situation, which she had actually accepted for something like 21 years or so beforehand. But she was blind to it. And so the moment of grace opened her eyes to that blindness, that this was actually very unhealthy and destructive. She sensed it deep down, but she wasn't aware of what it was doing to her. And then once she knew, the genie was out of the bottle and there was no putting it back. And it was only a matter of time. It still took another 2 years for her to realize what she had to do, because she wanted to save her marriage, right? She was going to mass every Sunday, was her husband, and her 2 children had grown up. But she realized she couldn't change this. And the husband unfortunately had some very serious emotional issues, which not only he couldn't work on, I think he was just so stuck in the emotional maturity, I'd say probably of an 8-year-old boy. But there was nothing he could do to realize or to undo that, or to even work through it. We certainly tried, but at the end of the day, that grace, it was a grace that the woman received, which led to the separation, but in fact it probably saved her from a mental breakdown in some level. So the awakenings that come may not necessarily be the awakenings that we expect, but it's always an awakening to truth, a deeper truth. That is, and then once we recognize it, we cannot run away from it. We have to act on it. Even though she didn't want to, but she knew that this was the thing that she had to do. So then May says, in order to do this, we must turn to the source of love. So we've made our choice to do the best choice. Then we must keep going further to turn to the very source of love itself. Grace, he says, comes from somewhere. It is given to us by someone or something. Our yes to love is a response to someone or something. I have said that efficiency is the how of life, and love is the why. Now we address the who. I call this someone or something God, which for us is obvious, but he's writing to also a non-Christian audience. It is a word and a name to which we all have many conditioned responses. Whether our responses make us comfortable or ill at ease, we can be sure of one thing: our understanding of God is not God. God is love, but love is not God. God is creator, but we also create. God is immanently within us, yet at the same time transcendently beyond us. God's grace is all-powerful, but we are always free to turn away from it. If love is always more than we can understand, how could we ever expect to comprehend love's source? This is worth stopping, because although we can seek and earnestly desire to encounter the source of love, the source of all love, we realize we cannot control that either. And very often in our loving, now as Christian believers, Christian lovers, that a lot of the loving or our praying, we're going to get into that as we come to the conclusion of our time of prayer and meditation, that they're often caught up in things or concepts or understandings, expectations that we've had of how prayer should be. And just as we can have concepts of how God is, and this can actually be a real restriction for our encounter with God. Because God will present himself to us, yes, in some, I won't say predictable ways, in some ways that he has presented himself to us before, but also at times he will present himself to us in a different way. But are we aware, or are we so limited or restricted in how we expect God to present himself to us, that if God were to present himself to us in another form, that we would say, well, that can't be God. It's like in the Psalm, one of the Psalms says, what worries me is that the way of the Most High has changed. I don't know if you remember that particular Psalm, the ways of the Most High has changed. In other words, the way in which the psalmist had been experiencing God, God's decided to respond differently now. And so he's complaining, the psalmist, that, hang on, you're not playing fair, you've just changed the rules, No, God will reveal himself as God wants to. It's part of who God is. So what he's saying is, I'm encouraging you to let yourself be you and to let God be God. This is in encountering the source of love. So, he goes on, as you touch this gentle permissiveness, you may run into just a little trouble with your religious beliefs. Probably not so much, but certainly some people will find this because they think their own views of how God is meant to be approached is actually different from how they would like to approach him. Religious belief is a two-edged sword. It can give us a historically sound foundation and sense of community that make it more possible to relax, to trust God's goodness, and to be more fully in love. But it can also stir up reactions that complicate our simple presence and flood us with mixed messages about the nature of God. And I don't know about you, but I've come across many people who have been taught that God is this and this and this, and this is the way they've prayed all their lives. And if you try to suggest something differently, they can't. It's like I'm suggesting a heresy, because it goes against what they've been told for so many years. This is what God is, this is who God is, and so they've actually unknowingly tried to make God into this limited kind of category, and as a result they restrict the amount of love that God can give them and God wants to give them. So as we turn then to the source of love, then we must, or rather desire the love source, we must now turn toward that source. And what is that turning toward the source is about? It's nothing short than prayer. When desire for love is felt, owned and intended, some kind of prayer happens. Notice how closely love and prayer just naturally flow one to the other. And in so doing, by the way, he's actually jumped from the natural to the supernatural. Prayer is generally a supernatural act because it requires the raising of the mind and heart to God. But he's talking, remember, to not just Christian believers here, he's talking to anyone who is genuinely, humanly authentic. So someone who wants to be a genuine human being and pay attention to what it means to be a human being, we must also be willing to pray. So this false dichotomy that we sometimes hear about, atheism, I don't believe in God, God is not real, God is like an optional extra. There's such foolish talk, because if you want to be truly human, you cannot but believe in God, because it leaves so many questions unanswered, but also the very drive that makes you love and seek the infinite love would somehow be destined to frustration. Prayer is the only way we can integrate our intention with our dependence upon grace. Desire in itself can be prayer when it turns us toward the source of love, turns our attention there, and aligns our concern in that direction. I think most people, he goes on to say, have trouble with prayer because prayer is really an act of love and therefore demands vulnerability. As with love, the more we try to control prayer, the less prayer can actually happen. Yet the desire to defend and protect oneself is understandable. Prayer is where we most directly face the truth of ourselves and of the world. It is risky business indeed. Prayer is the place where we most directly face the truth about ourselves and the world, raising our mind and heart to God. Because of our fear of depending on grace, it sounds like contradictory this in some way, because we want God's grace, but God's grace requires us to be vulnerable to it, to rest upon it. And yet we pull back from that because it's so we see how complicated we can be, you know. And I know I do. I laugh at myself when I catch myself out and I realize you are so goofy. You want God to help you, God seeks to help you, and then you pull back because you don't like the help that He gives you. And I think in some ways we all do it at various moments of our lives. Because of our fear depending on grace, conscious, intentional prayer, which should be the most honest, loving enterprise of the human heart, sometimes becomes one of the most dishonest. It seems we will do almost anything to domesticate prayer, to restrict its inherently radical nature. Allow as much openness to radical freshness, he says, as you can. Yet be willing to give yourself to the ritual or the routine if that seems most authentic. I remember one time in a seminary, it was a philosophy class or a moral theology class, I think, and the professor asked a question there, and there were seminarians and an older lady. The seminarians had no answer straight away. And then this woman who was in her 40s, she said, the question was, how do I know if I'm really praying? And she just jumped in and said, your life begins to change. Your life begins to change. And how many people that we've seen who have prayed every day, perhaps we prayed every day, and we look at our lives or we see their lives and we think, there's no change happening. Are they really encountering the mystery of love? Are they? Because it doesn't make sense that if we're really encountering the mystery of God in prayer, the truth about ourselves is being revealed, then nothing begins to change, over time at least. So that's one of the signs, and I think that, I still remember her name, but I think it was a very true answer. Life begins to change when we are praying. If you are trying to be honest and true with yourself and God, you will become aware of such concerns from time to time, the tendency sometimes to have ourselves on, and it would be artificial not to respond to them. But at the end of the day, he says, there's no fear in it, as long as we're always seeking the truth about ourselves as honestly as we can, then this is surely the most honest form of prayer. So he's not saying that we shouldn't have formal prayer, we shouldn't pray the rosary. I love the rosary, I pray it every day. We shouldn't have the formal ritual of the Mass or the Divine Office. The Church requires it of us. But this mental prayer is so profound because it is in fact what allows us to be most ourselves in the presence of the mystery.